countless volunteer committees that are constituted by membership appointed by the Board of Supervisors that receive zero compensation. So I agree with you. It's a difficult volunteer job, and so there needs to be some coverage for expenses. I think we all agree with that. But there are many committees of people that some just receive mileage, no other compensation. Some don't even receive miles, and they have to travel from all points of the county to convene quarterly or every 2 months for meetings where they receive no compensation. So there's a lot of that, and that's what keeps Mendocino County going, is that volunteer spirit. And it is primarily a volunteer choice that individuals make.
And I will not argue that. That's my whole point here, is that when you're dealing with a volunteer organization, you need to recognize that. And this one is not just a volunteer organization, it's also a state mandated watchdog. And that's a difference from some of the others, from the other committees we have. And this is something that meets literally on a daily basis, 2 to 3 to 4 times a week. This is not a monthly meeting or a bi-monthly meeting or even a once a quarter meeting. These are people who are giving up substantial portions of their life. When we go through the initial interviews to become a grand juror, one of the first questions that somebody on that panel, and the panel is composed of the judge, the chief executive officer, chief administrative officer of the court, and the prior grand jury foreman, one of the questions asked is, are you willing to spend 25 hours plus of your life each week dealing with the grand jury? And that 25 hours tends to be the minimum time that is spent. I personally spend upwards of 35 to 40 hours a week on my job, and I have. And I do regard this as a job because it's something I am dedicated to. And I think if you queried each and every one of the grand jurors, you'll find they spend at least the 25 hours a week, and most of them spend 40 plus hours a week. Much of the work being done at home. Since the advent of the internet and the ability to pull information off the internet, you'll find that a lot of us have our own computers, and we spend a considerable amount of time doing that. The end result of it comes out in our reports, and I think our reports over the last year were fairly well written. I hope the reports this year will even be better well written, because we have the time that we're devoting to it using the cost-saving technologies that are available to us.
Good. Thank you.
Supervisor McCowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is all good discussion. It's also not really relevant to the item that's in front of us today. The item in front of us is amending this ordinance. Now, I would like to make a couple of comments, and I'd like to ask for your cooperation. I don't really get an understanding from you that you understand the budget situation of the county. We are in a very serious budget situation. So I object to the characterization that the efforts of the executive office to look for budget savings at every opportunity is in any way an effort to constrain the activities of the grand jury or limit its ability to investigate. That's not the point at all. I also will disagree with your statement that you've done everything you can to constrain costs. I think you could think this through a little further, particularly now that we have the allowance that grand jurors who live more than 30 miles from the county seat can stay overnight and be reimbursed for that. I think that rather than having to meet 50 weeks out of the year, you could adjust that and have some meetings perhaps where you don't meet or don't meet as frequently, and perhaps work longer hours. It has been stated it's a volunteer position, and I speak as a former grand juror about 20 years ago. Another thing that I think you could affect a savings, and I did read your letter of September 3rd, I believe it was, last year, and I do appreciate the efforts that were made to reduce costs, but I think you could go further. You note in there that there was a reduction made of committee service from each member serving on 4 committees to serving on 3. When I was on the grand jury, we each served on 2. And it seemed to work very effectively, very efficiently. So I think that's another thing that could be looked at. So I think there's options here where the grand jury could, if it wished, achieve greater efficiencies to reduce the necessary amount of expenditures to do the same amount of work and stay within the allocated budget. But I really think we're not going to resolve this here today. I think it is a discussion that we should have when we're putting the budget together. And hopefully we can work cooperatively together to address these issues and resolve them.
I'm certainly open to any suggestions on how we can save money. I would be hesitant, though, to put controls on what the grand jury can investigate and how many investigations should be done in a year. Some topics...
Excuse me, you're missing the point again. I didn't say anything about controlling the amount of investigations the grand jury can do. I'm talking about doing your work in a more efficient manner if possible, and I think that's achievable.
That may well be achievable, but the end result of putting fiscal restraints of the kind you're talking to the grand jury translates to potential control over the topics the grand jury looks at. That's a concern that I have. What we wish to address when we look at these things, I want the grand jury, in my personal opinion, to be able to investigate anything that it deems appropriate when it finds those issues to investigate. Having an inadequate budget to do so in travel means that topics that should be investigated wouldn't be investigated, and this is the use of the purse to control the outcome of an investigation. It starts with the control of the purse, and that's what limits the investigation. You mentioned...
Mr. Finley,
yes.
We're kind of getting off course here.
I understand.
We're going to have several budget workshops,
yes.
And it's really, I think, that's the appropriate time to talk about the interactions and assign the dollars to the grand jury. So I'm trying to move this along. Supervisor Colfax.
I want to say first, I appreciate the efforts to involve people in outlying areas in the work of the grand jury. I would suggest that represents more inclusiveness of the population of the people who should be looking at what's happening in our government agencies. And I think that's the primary, or public agencies, that's the primary function of the grand jury, I believe. It's not just anything that comes down the pike. But again, I'm not going to get into that discussion. That's my understanding. I am concerned not at the grand jury as such, but at the directive given by the judge and accepted by those who come onto the grand jury and expressed here correctly, Mr. Finley, saying you give up 2 years of your life. There aren't very many people in Mendocino County who have that luxury, retired or not. I mean, there are people who would be willing to give up perhaps 10 hours a week. There are some people that are willing to give up 5 hours a week. But when you have people taking on 20 hours a week work, and that's what the judge is saying to you, you are talking about a very, very constricted population that has that either luxury or that kind of energy or that kind of masochism to take this on. And I am concerned here not with trying to constrain your work by the budget. The last thing in the world I want to do is constrain your work. But the main thing that I'm concerned about here is as a volunteer working 20 hours a week, the extent to which we feel as supervisors, perhaps, when we look at the kind of week we put in, and we get paid for doing it, and still have reasons to feel that maybe we're being inadequately compensated for the great effort we're putting out. If you're working 20 hours a week for nothing, over time, the only sense you can have as you go through this is a sense that we are being shortchanged, or we are overworking, we're unappreciated, and overworked and underappreciated. Great combination. And my feeling is that one of the things that might be